Sarah and her friends were always on the lookout for the scariest haunted houses. One evening, they stumbled upon a Reddit post promising an experience like no other. It described a secluded haunted house, deep in the woods, far from the city. Excited, they debated its authenticity, but the tales of terror only fueled their curiosity. "We have to check it out," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. Her friends nodded in agreement, always up for an adventure. They decided to go that weekend, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. They had no idea what awaited them in those dark woods. The day of the adventure arrived. Sarah and her friends piled into her car, their nervous laughter filling the air. The drive was long, the roads becoming narrower and more winding as they ventured deeper into the forest. Tall, ancient trees loomed overhead, casting dark shadows on the path. The GPS signal grew weak, and they relied on printed directions and a map. The deeper they went, the more isolated they felt. There was no sign of civilization, just the oppressive silence of the woods. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at the location. It was a dilapidated old house, shrouded in mist and almost hidden by overgrown vegetation. The sight of it sent shivers down their spines. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. They nodded and approached the house. The house stood before them, its windows dark and empty. It loomed ominously against the night sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like ghostly fingers. The air around it was still, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to cross its threshold. The paint was peeling, and the wooden boards creaked under their feet as they stepped onto the porch. Each step they took seemed to echo through the silence, amplifying their growing sense of dread. The wood felt fragile, as if it might give way at any moment, plunging them into the unknown depths below. A sign hanging crookedly above the door read, "Enter if you dare." The letters were faded and barely legible, but the message was clear. It was a warning, a challenge, and an invitation all at once. The sign swayed slightly in the breeze, adding to the eerie ambiance. They exchanged nervous glances but pushed the door open. The creak of the door was almost deafening in the stillness, and it felt as though the house was groaning in protest. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they stepped inside, unsure of what awaited them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. It was as if time had stood still within these walls, preserving the remnants of a long-forgotten past. The dust particles danced in the beams of their flashlights, creating an almost magical, yet sinister atmosphere. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with debris. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and remnants of what once might have been a home lay scattered around. Each step they took disturbed the silence, sending small clouds of dust into the air. The faint sound of eerie music played in the background, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. It was a haunting melody, one that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The music wrapped around them, pulling them deeper into the house's sinister embrace. As they moved deeper into the house, the rooms seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. Hallways that should have led to other parts of the house looped back on themselves, creating a disorienting maze. It was as if the house was playing tricks on their minds, testing their resolve. It was as if the house itself was alive, shifting and changing around them. Walls seemed to breathe, floors undulated beneath their feet, and shadows moved independently of any light source. The house was a living entity, feeding off their fear and confusion. They encountered strange, macabre scenes. Mannequins dressed in tattered clothes, blood-stained walls, and grotesque decorations. Each room was a tableau of horror, meticulously arranged to unsettle and terrify. The mannequins' lifeless eyes seemed to follow them, adding to the sense of being watched. Then they saw him. Standing at the end of a long hallway was a clown. His presence was both absurd and terrifying, a grotesque figure that seemed out of place yet perfectly at home in this house of horrors. The hallway stretched out before them, a gauntlet they had to traverse. His face was painted in bright, garish colors, but his eyes were cold and dead. The contrast was jarring, a mockery of joy and life. His smile was fixed, a permanent sneer that promised nothing but malice. As they approached, the air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. The clown was not just a figure of fear, he was the embodiment of the house's malevolent spirit. The clown's presence was unnerving. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on them. Sarah and her friends exchanged uneasy glances. They tried to laugh it off, but the fear was palpable. They continued through the house, but the clown seemed to follow them. Every time they turned a corner, there he was, his eyes boring into them. No matter how fast they walked, the clown was always there. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. They had to keep moving forward, deeper into the haunted house. The deeper they went, the more intense the fear became. The rooms grew darker, the air thicker. The clown was always there, lurking in the shadows. His presence was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. They entered a room that looked like a twisted carnival. Broken rides and torn tents filled the space, and the sound of a distant calliope echoed through the air. The clown was there, standing by an old Ferris wheel. His eyes never left Sarah. They ran, desperate to escape the nightmare. But no matter where they went, the clown was always one step ahead. They finally made it out of the house, gasping for air. The night had been filled with terror, and their hearts were still pounding from the adrenaline rush. The darkness outside seemed almost welcoming compared to the horrors they had just faced inside. The night was still and silent, a stark contrast to the terror they had just experienced. The eerie quietness of the empty street seemed to mock their fear, as if the world outside was oblivious to the nightmare they had just escaped. They got into the car and drove back in silence, the fear still lingering. The road ahead was dark and winding, and every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. The silence in the car was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts, replaying the night's events over and over. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of the clown's eyes on her. It was as if those cold, unblinking eyes were still watching her, even now. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the clown standing there, grinning menacingly. Back home, Sarah tried to calm herself. She sat on her bed, her mind racing. The safety of her home felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the memory of the clown. She took deep breaths, trying to steady her nerves, but the fear was too deeply rooted. She took a shower, hoping to wash away the fear. The warm water cascaded over her, but it did little to soothe her frayed nerves. She scrubbed her skin, as if trying to erase the night's events from her memory, but the image of the clown haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw its painted face, its sinister smile. The mirror reflected her own haunted expression, a stark reminder that the fear was far from gone. The next morning, she woke up to a chill running down her spine. The room was cold, and the air felt heavy with an unspoken dread. She sat up, her heart pounding, as if sensing that something was terribly wrong. On her desk was a small, blood-stained clown nose. It was a grotesque reminder of the previous night, a tangible piece of the nightmare that had followed her home. The sight of it made her stomach churn. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her hands trembling. The clown nose felt cold and sticky, and she could almost hear the echo of the clown's laughter. She dropped it quickly, as if it had burned her. How had it gotten there? She hadn't brought anything home from the haunt. The realization sent a new wave of fear through her. She looked around the room, half expecting to see the clown lurking in the shadows. The presence of the clown nose in her room was an ominous sign. It was as if the clown had left a piece of itself behind, a sinister token of its visit. The fear that had gripped her the night before was back, stronger than ever, and she knew that this was far from over. Days passed, and the fear only grew. Sarah tried to go about her daily life, but the clown was always in the back of her mind. She started to notice strange things happening around her house. Objects moved on their own, and she heard faint giggles in the dead of night. Her friends tried to assure her it was just her imagination, but she knew better. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps in her hallway. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer. She could hear the faint squeak of clown shoes. The fear was paralyzing. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The footsteps stopped outside her door. The haunting incidents grew more frequent. Sarah would find her belongings rearranged and eerie messages written in red lipstick on her mirrors. "I'm watching you," one message read. The fear was overwhelming. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The clown was always there in the shadows, watching. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard the giggle again. It was closer this time, almost in her room. She turned around, and there he was, standing at the foot of her bed. His eyes were cold and dead, his smile menacing. Sarah's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Sarah started to research the haunted house, hoping to find some answers. She discovered that the house had a dark history. It had been the site of a circus that had burned down years ago, killing several performers, including a clown named Bobo. Bobo's spirit was said to haunt the house, seeking revenge on anyone who entered. Sarah's fear deepened as she read the stories. The descriptions matched the clown she had seen. She showed an old photo of Bobo to her friends, and their faces went pale. They recognized him too. The realization that they were being haunted by a vengeful spirit was terrifying. The night of the cleansing ritual arrived. The paranormal expert set up candles and incense around Sarah's house. She chanted in a language Sarah didn't understand, calling on spirits to help banish Bobo. Sarah and her friends watched, their fear palpable. As the ritual progressed, the air grew colder. Shadows danced on the walls, and the faint sound of a calliope filled the air. The expert's chanting grew louder, more urgent. Sarah felt a presence in the room, a cold, menacing presence. Suddenly the candles flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Sarah heard the giggle again, closer than ever. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder and screamed. The room was tense, filled with an oppressive silence. The air was thick with an unspoken dread, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Bobo's cold eyes were locked onto Sarah, his gaze piercing through the dim light. His painted smile was a cruel mockery, a mask hiding the malevolence beneath. The expert continued to chant, her voice growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Her words were ancient, filled with power, echoing off the walls and filling the room with a palpable energy. Sarah felt the air around her tighten, as if she was being squeezed by an invisible force. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps, and her heart raced as if trying to escape her chest. Suddenly, Bobo lunged towards her, his movements unnaturally fast and fluid. It was as if he was gliding through the air, a predator closing in on its prey. Sarah screamed and fell back, her heart pounding in her chest. She hit the floor hard, the impact jarring her senses, but she couldn't afford to stay down. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. The expert threw a handful of salt at Bobo, and he recoiled, hissing in anger. The salt seemed to burn him, his skin sizzling where it made contact. He writhed in pain, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and fear. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, and the air grew colder still. An eerie mist began to form, swirling around their feet, adding to the already oppressive atmosphere. Sarah saw a glint of something on the floor, the blood-stained clown nose. It lay there, a grotesque reminder of the horror they were facing. She grabbed it, her hands trembling. The object felt cold and sticky in her grasp, but she held on tight, knowing it might be their only chance. "Go back to where you came from," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She stood her ground, refusing to back down. The clown's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear before he disappeared into the shadows. The room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight lifting as the darkness receded. Sarah and the expert embraced, their relief palpable. They had faced the terror and emerged victorious, but the memory of Bobo's cold eyes would haunt them forever. Slowly, the room began to return to normal. The shadows retreated, and light filled the space once more. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left behind would remain.